Hello.
It's going to get rougher.
Today is December 21st, 2017, and my name is Will Greer, and I am interviewing Susan Billeaud for the Women's March Oral History Project. How are you doing today, Susan?
I'm fine, thanks. How are you?
I am doing well, thank you. So we are going to start with just some background information about you.
Okay.
What year were you born?
1969.
1969. Excellent. So, where were you born?
Covington, Louisiana.
Where is that?
It is north of New Orleans.
Okay.
And with that information, you can probably steal my entire identity.
I promise your identity will not be. I promise I will not steal your identity.
I understand. You and any listener.
Right. So, can you describe your family's political leanings when you were growing up?
Conservative.
Okay.
Very conservative. Very much red state. Yeah. We didn't think of it in those terms, but yeah. Originally, I guess what we would call Dixiecrat.
Mm-hmm.
I was actually the first Republican in my family.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I came along, graduated high school in 1987, which was, I suppose, the tail end of Reagan, going into George Bush one, and I decided that it was a cool thing to be a Republican, and my mother warned me against it because there were no Republicans in the South at that time, and I wouldn't be able to vote in a primary. But I did it anyway, and very shortly, all of the Democrats became Republicans. And within a few years after that, I stopped being a Republican and elected to be an independent.
Okay.
So, ever since then, I've either voted or not, depending on what I believed about the character of the individual candidate and not so much parties. And there were several elections in which I refused to pull a lever for any candidate and president.
Okay. So you would describe your political leanings as independent, or?
Definitely independent, moderate,
Okay.
I would say, socially liberal. I would hesitate to say fiscally conservative in today's climate because I believe that there's a connotation of there being a degree of social injustice now associated with fiscal conservatism. So I supported Bernie Sanders for president very strongly. And I believe that there is a sort of progressivism that is not the fascist variety that seems to be in power today.
Okay. What was it that motivated you to support Bernie Sanders?
I think he had the absolutely correct economic message. I studied economics, and I suppose my strong point in my baccalaureate program in economics for me was macroeconomics. And he was absolutely correct about the velocity of money and the slowing of that velocity being related to the income inequality that we see today. And so that was a really big issue for me.
What do you mean by velocity of money?
Well, money doesn't change hands very quickly. The general economy tends to go into recession.
Okay.
I could draw a picture for you of what I mean by this, but effectively, if you don't pay wages and if you don't spend money on infrastructure and capital expenditures, even with or without business, whether it's government or whatever, there isn't enough turnover of money. Our money supply is based on there being money changing hands. Money sitting in a bank account does no one any good. And so by concentrating the wealth, and this sounds like it's straight out of Bernie's platform, but he nailed it, in my view, by concentrating the wealth in the hands of people who tend to spend only a mere fraction of their total wealth at any given time, and they simply sort of stockpile or accumulate that, you do a couple of things. But the main thing is you slow that turnover. So when you talk about money in the Federal Reserve, in the past we used to consider things like the multiplier effect is what they called it. That multiplier is very low now because people who have no money can't buy products, goods, and services. And it's contributing to things like the death of retail, and it's only going to be continually exacerbated and eventually the economy will shrink ever more. Until what point, I don't know. But even businesses that rely on the purchasing of other businesses will ultimately be affected, because at some point the money for all of that spending enters the chain through consumers. This is a consumer-based economy. And wage inequality is a big problem for that and many other reasons. But the drag on the economy was a big concern of mine. And then, of course, the general concerns. I think in the fullness of time, I began to understand issues better, like homelessness, food insecurity, food deserts in certain areas. I began to see that the problem was the structure, and that the direction of this country today is more toward neo-feudalism than it is toward any sort of capitalism that we might have enjoyed. And even in my own lifetime, I remember, the wages that I used to make being fairly attractive in retrospect. I mean, at the time, I didn't think I was making that much money. At the time, I wasn't. But every decade that has progressed, it's been harder and harder to get even that money. So I think the fullness of time has informed many of my political views. And I think that of all the candidates, I think Bernie Sanders got it mostly right. I would say that about 9 out of 10 of his platform positions I completely agreed with, and for the reasons he stated. So.
Okay, well, let's backtrack for a second. And what is your profession?
I'm a business transactions attorney.
Okay.
And that means that I write contracts for a living, mainly. I also do a bit of corporate formation and restructuring, and I do a lot of regulatory compliance work as well.
Where do you live right now?
I live in Decatur, Georgia.
Oh, great. I live in Decatur. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
So how did you get from your Dixiecrat upbringing in Covington, Louisiana, to where you are now in Decatur, Georgia?
In what respect?
Just sort of what's the nutshell or more detailed biography on there, if you like. I mean, how did you...
I've moved about 50 times in my life.
Okay.
That includes intra-city moves. But education, I married someone who was pursuing higher education in Birmingham, Alabama. We moved back and forth between Louisiana and Birmingham a few times. And then in Birmingham, the last time we moved to Birmingham was a minute before the Great Recession started. And I mark that as being the bubble, the real estate bubble burst the minute we sold our house in Lafayette, Louisiana. And so the proximity to Atlanta was very attractive. I don't think that until I began to kind of straddle cities in an effort to cobble together a solo law practice, I really considered living here full time. But I had always been attracted to Decatur in particular. So one thing led to another, and when my marriage ended, I moved here full time, thinking that, of all the economies in all of the South, and I do like living in the South, that Atlanta was going to come back first. And it has.
Okay. So how long have you lived in Decatur? How long have you lived in the Atlanta area?
I've lived, in North Decatur, North Druid Hills, and Decatur exclusively, and I moved here in 2011, I think.
Okay.
That's about right. Yeah, 2011, about summertime, July. I seem to recall moving into my first apartment around July 4th weekend of 2011. Yeah.
Cool.
But I'd practiced for the preceding 3 years here.
Oh, okay.
I became licensed in Georgia in 2008.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we talked about what your political leanings are. So prior to the Women's March, how would you have described your past political involvement?
Passive.
Okay.
Extremely passive. The Republic, even if I had disagreements with policy, I felt like in general the Republic was fairly safe.
Okay.
I don't feel that way anymore.
That leads to the next question then. We'll get to the brass tacks. So why did you march on January 21st?
A lot of reasons. I think, one of the more interesting questions that even precedes that for me is, why did I begin speaking out?
Okay.
Because for me, even speaking out publicly on social media was a huge decision. And it was a decision that friends of mine, even Democrats, warned me against. I began to express very negative views of our current sitting president. I don't ever really refer to him that way, so it's a little difficult. I don't actually use his name, his given name anyway. I have a special name for him. But, I was warned by friends of mine that speaking out would be politically divisive and could hurt my business, my practice. And I remember thinking that I had always known that if the moment ever came, that I felt it was necessary to exercise my First Amendment rights, that it would be in the protection of First Amendment rights. And I remember my reply to my friend who expressed that concern being that if I allow social pressure to silence me, I might as well be censored. And I felt that it was very important for me to begin to speak out. And interestingly, apparently, a lot of people in my gender, race, and age demographic felt the same exact way. And so all of a sudden, there were women everywhere. And I don't know why it is we tend to move in herds, but we did. And a lot of us decided that for ourselves, for our families, for our children, that it was important to register publicly our opposition to this regime. And we saw it that way. And we saw it that way immediately because we began to see fascistic indications, things said that were unheard of before. And suddenly you have a wave of women and men, minorities, lesbians, gay, trans, bi, queer, white, middle-aged women who had never been politically active before, had never protested, were terrified of the whole process, joining together with people of color and people who were part of the Occupy resistance movement who were professionals. And that was a very interesting meeting. There was a lot of chatter, and I think rightly so, about how white women need to get behind, because white women didn't realize what they were doing and what they tended to do, which was assume that because they were white, they should lead it. But without any of the experience of actually participating in protests or any kind of political action, it really made a lot more sense to defer to our sisters and brothers of color and our younger brothers and sisters who had been doing this sort of thing for some time.
Okay. Well, you said, it was out of opposition to the person who is the sitting president and his current regime. And you said you saw fascistic indicators. Would you Would you be willing to talk a little more about what you specifically opposed and what you see as fascistic indicators?
The public maligning and humiliation of people from various minority groups throughout the campaign and immediately after. I mean, shortly after the Women's March was the Muslim ban,
Right.
which we protested. The attacks on science, on education, on poor people, direct and indirect. The attacks on free communication, the attacks on the media. I mean, Amy Siskind, the tweeter, keeps a list. She has a website and a blog and a spreadsheet, literally, and every week she reports the number, and it's tens or sometimes hundreds of authoritarian actions taken that week by the government. It's horrifying. Thousands of small things, and her whole position, and she's not wrong, is that every week we need to pay attention to how far we've shifted culturally through these minor actions, these seemingly minor actions, toward an authoritarian dictatorship, because that's where we're headed. Moreover, I understand Donald Trump's personality. I know a lot of people with it. His illness.
And what is that?
Pathological narcissism.
Okay.
Sociological, sociopathic behavior. I've known several people with that condition, and I know what they're capable of, and I know how far they were willing to go to do any number of things that they consider for themselves. And it doesn't matter, public or positive or negative. They feed off of attention. They demand it. And if he has to sink the entire country to get it, he will continue relentlessly. He has to. It's a sickness. So there were a lot of things. And for me, the Women's March was about, saying unequivocally to our government that we won't stand for it, and an appeal to anyone who has a soul left in that government to stand with us and for us. But I wish I could say I was that brave initially, because I wasn't.
Well, I mean, it's a lot for one person to act against. I mean, I think
But like I said, we women tend to move as a herd. And I had a lot of trepidation about marching. And I remember Googling everything I could find. And thank goodness women were organizing the march, so they understood. They provided us with the number, the get out of jail number, and tips on where to write that on your body in the event you were handcuffed, what supplies you needed to bring with you in the event you're tear gassed, how to interact with police, how to interact with other protesters, what happens if shots ring out or shit goes sideways. Just all of this information was being exchanged on social media because we had no idea what we were doing. And at the end of the day, if it hadn't been for several friends of mine going and having discussions with them about safe places where we could convene if things got terrible. And I ended up actually being asked by one of the organizers who has a physical disability to help her just get through the march because she tires very easily and is considered mobility impaired. And so something like this undertaking was very daunting. So she wanted me with her. I'd gone to several, I don't know what you call them. I mean, I call them cons, but I'd worked with her in situations where we attended large gatherings of human beings and it helped her get through those events.
Cons like the sci-fi fantasy conventions.
Yeah,
like
conventions.
Dragon Con.
Yeah, where just tons of people are present and there's a lot of walking. And so she trusted me and she knew that I would help her get what she needed when she needed it. And so she invited me to help her with this event, and as a result, I got to sit on the front row.
Oh, great.
Yeah, throughout the entire thing.
That is terrific. So let me, which march did you attend?
What do you mean?
Well, there were marches in several different cities.
Oh, the Atlanta March.
Okay.
Sorry, yeah.
That's cool. So you attended the Atlanta March, and this was your first time participating in a march?
Of any sort, way, shape, or form. Never thought I would do it. Was always slightly suspicious of people who did. I'd actually met Steve Eberhardt.
Okay.
We were discussing him earlier, who does a lot of work in the civil rights space, recording through photographs various actions. And so he and I knew one another socially, and he had talked to me about a lot of stuff, and actually he had taken some photos at a resistance action against some neo-Nazi Klansmen who gathered at Stone Mountain a few months before. And one of his photographs in particular was very striking. And I remember he had an opportunity to present some of those photos to a competition, I believe, in a gallery. And he brought over a selection of photos, and included was this particular photo of a woman standing on a Confederate flag with her hand raised defiantly, and bemused police officers standing behind her. And she was just physically confronting these Nazis. And he asked me, among all these other photographs, which one I would choose to submit. I'm like, that one. And he won, I think.
Oh, cool.
It was a great photograph. But he had been telling me about all the various players in the civil rights movement, the Black Panthers, the new Black Panthers, and the various significance of all of these things. And before that, I'd known nothing. I knew nothing about anything with regard to civil rights. I didn't know about Antifa. I didn't know about the actions that they were taking, and I hate to even speak of them as one thing, because it's just anyone who opposes fascism or fascists. But I began to really pay attention then to the white supremacy movement and the sort of reawakening by encouragement of the Trump campaign, and the various actions they began to take. And some of them were laughably unattended. Some of them were just laughable. But some of them were concerning, very concerning. And I really did begin to sympathize with the counter-protesters. And I began to understand, who the players were. So I wasn't at that point unacquainted with protests and counter-protests, but like I said, I wasn't terribly brave. And I think if all of my friends hadn't done it, I might have, bowed out at the last minute. Not out of lack of sympathy, but just out of, I needed a Sherpa,
I got you. Well, so before the march, what were you expecting or hoping to get out of the experience?
Like I said, I was really just sort of terrified of the whole thing. I didn't know what to expect. I prepared for the worst, really, but I decided that I had to do it, and it really wasn't peer pressure. I mean, it wasn't that my friend said, "You must do this with me," but knowing that they would be there made me a little braver about undertaking it. I believed in what the march stood for. I believed in what it represented, but I had no idea. I figured the Washington March would be huge. I had no idea how big the Atlanta March would be. I had no idea who would be there, other than, the 5 or 6 people I knew who were going. I really was unprepared. I knitted a pink pussy hat, one to give away to my friend. Unfortunately, I dropped it when I got out of the cab. I knew I didn't want to park anywhere around the area. Parking was tight anyway. It was a dreary, rainy kind of day. And actually, after I arrived, it ended up pouring down rain. But I was privileged. I'll explain later if you want to get into the chronology of events that day. But I don't know. I don't know. I didn't expect what it was. I didn't have any context. I mean, when have white women knitted a bunch of hats and then gone out and done something like that? You know?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, never. But there were patterns online, and it was something fun to do. But I was really angry. I was really, I again felt, now or never. I've got to start. I've got to take a stand here. I'm not the sort of person who can sit on the sidelines anyway, although I have resisted being much of a joiner. I don't join clubs easily. I don't join groups easily. I usually hang back quite a lot. But this was important. I knew this was important. What was going to happen, whether I was going to be arrested or attacked by counter protesters or jailed, for something else, or caught up in something, that or hurt, and so I was prepared for anything. I didn't know what would happen. But what did happen was wonderful,
How was it wonderful? What was the?
Well, I mean, maybe I don't know. I don't want to derail your whole conversation, but I mean, telling it in pieces isn't really the way my brain works.
Okay. Well, we can. I mean,
I was just thinking of the timeline. I mean, it was wonderful in so many ways. A friend of mine who is, I don't know how to describe her. She works for the government, so she probably won't be doing your interview with you.
Okay.
She might, but I don't know, maybe. She has a much more, I think, pronounced liberal bent than I do, but she came over with glitter and markers and we made signs. I'd already knit the hats. And so that was, it was just, there was a sort of sense of occasion about it toward the end. Like I said, notwithstanding all of the trepidation I just described, there was also a sense that it was a celebration. And so the sparkly glitter and the markers and whatever and the poster board, and we were trying to think of, our slogans, what they were going to be and stuff. And so I had a foam core board I figured out how to fold in half so I could have two messages. It was just all this sort of crafting aspect to this whole thing. White women, what are you going to do? But, I, again, had the front row seat. So when I arrived, it was my purpose to find my friend, the physically disabled friend, who was one of the organizers and who was one of the speakers ultimately. And so I knew I was supposed to go in a side door and I was to be on some sort of list. So I'm standing outside and it starts pouring down rain, and I finally figured out which was the correct door, and I was on the list, and I was escorted into this lovely dry room where there were bagels and bottled water and a place to hang my poncho and a clean bathroom. And I was in a fishbowl looking out of the Civil Rights Museum at all the people who were coming. And I couldn't see beyond maybe 10 rows, but many of them were pressed against the window because there was a bit of an overhang and you could be dry there. And there were some tents around and stuff like that, but this was still early yet. And so I was really in sort of the lucky place. So I'm hanging out, and Big Frida's in there, and she's, a local celebrity. No, sorry, not Big Frida. Who am I thinking of? Baton Bob. Confusing.
Bob, okay.
I'm confusing my transgenders. How wrong
Bob.
It was Baton Bob. That's what it was. I'm trying to remember who these people are. Baton Bob is a local Atlanta celebrity. Big Frida is a celebrity from my hometown of New Orleans. Sorry, thinking of different people. But it was Baton Bob. And he was going to be sort of the majorette for the parade. So he was there, and then this band that I guess is sort of famous. I don't know. I have pictures of me with them. I don't know who these famous people are. There are a lot of famous people, but it was a group of, I guess, hip hop artists or rap artists or something. Again, I don't know who these people are. And then there were all these other people passing through, you know, public figures, some of whom I knew, some who I didn't know, and then the organizers, which were, you know, a neighbor of a friend of mine, Janelle Green. Gerald Griggs, who's an activist and a civil rights attorney in town, and then some other people who I had yet met. You know, one of the speakers was Muslim, and then Gina was you know, she was the one who was talking about Medicare and Medicaid because she and her daughters are all disabled. So it was, you know, it was a really interesting room. I met a few people there. Like I said, a lot of the people just didn't really ring a bell at the time. You know, at the end of the parade, too, I met the woman who I hope will be the future governor of Georgia, Stacey Abrams, but I didn't know who she was. She was just some lady who was asking me if I had some water.
Oh, wow.
Because the bottled water at the end at Liberty Park, they had stowed it way away from the stage, and nobody knew where it was. And so before they found it, like, everybody was really thirsty. So I gave her a slug out of a clean bottle I happened to have. So that was cool. But yeah, you know, so there were all these people, and I think John Lewis, who was a sitting congressman for Georgia, arrived late. They were worried he wasn't going to make it. He arrived after the speakers took the stage, as I recall. Hank Johnson appeared magically. I don't know if he was in the room at the time. There were a lot of people in there. I'd say like 20 or 30 people. He is also a representative. He's from the 4th District. John Lewis is the 5th. He's a congressman, and he walked with us. And I met former mayor of Atlanta, Shirley Franklin, on the march. And I met this guy, and I'm going to look his name up because I meant to do that before. But he was sort of teaching us the old songs and the old civil rights songs. And he was a guy, let me get the right name here. Hold on. He had a hit rap song in the 80s. And so I don't know if, you know, what that was about. General Larry Platt. I met General Larry Platt. Now, Larry Platt was an old civil and political rights activist, and he wrote a song called Pants on the Ground. I don't know if you know Pants on the Ground.
I've never heard that song.
Yeah, like the Bears, the football team, did it, and
okay.
They did a video of it and stuff. And as of I'm looking at his Wikipedia right now.
Super Bowl shuffle from the Bears. So.
Yeah, Pants on. I think it was the Bears. I don't know who those people are. Anyway, yeah. So he wrote the song, and he apparently used to hang out with people like Martin Luther King. So he was like in the room. I want to say he might have been Dr. King's bodyguard at one point. But he was teaching us the old civil rights chants. He had a bullhorn, and he would kick it off. And Gerald Griggs also knew a lot of the chants. And we didn't know any of them. We were carrying water, you know?
That's very cool. Let me
yeah,
So who were the people you originally traveled to the march with?
I came by myself. I was meeting Gina Guerrero Clark.
Okay.
Yeah.
And how do you know her?
How do I know Gina? I met her years ago when I first moved to Atlanta. I think through some sort of social group. I met her, and we started going, like I said earlier, we started going to cons together. And hit it off. And she and I actually went to our very first Dragon Con alone together in 2012.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, she and I, neither of us had been. It was a bucket list thing for her. I was excited to go. And we went together. And she said to me at the beginning of the con, I have one thing I want to do. I want to meet Stan Lee. And we, at 9:30 a.m., we're walking through the motor court of the Marriott. And lo and behold, there's Stan Lee. And so we met him, took pictures with him. He and his bodyguard, before anybody else noticed him. I was like, well, there's Stan Lee. It It was stellar. That's the sort of luck we always had together, she and I. So, yeah, so I knew her. She got me on the list. She got me in the room, and I got to carry her backpack through the entire parade and walk 5 feet from these luminaries of Atlanta and Georgia political scene.
So you made a sign?
I made 2 signs. Well, they were on the reverse of one another.
What did they say?
One had an arrow that I kind of carried it low over my chest, and it said uninsurable. And the other sign said more bridges, fewer walls. And that was a reference to Donald Trump's campaign promise that he would build a wall between the United States and Mexico.
And make Mexico pay for it.
Yeah, there was that. And also a reference in my mind to Bernie Sanders' discussions about the dire need in the United States for infrastructure repair. We do actually need bridges.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, what were some other signs that you saw at the march that you remember?
I don't remember them, but cool. I have photos of them. Sure. I have a photo I'm looking at now. Our bodies, our minds, our power. Mm-hmm. You may not be a racist, but you elected one. Let's see. What else do they say? Men of quality do not fear equality.
Okay.
I saw a lot of fight like a girl. I saw a little girl on the train afterward. I took the train back because it was just easier than in the pandemonium trying to call a cab. And I remember she was wearing one of those Cyndi Lauper shirts that says, "Girls just want to have fun, the mental rights."
Oh, nice.
Yeah, she was cutest little thing. I have a photo of her. My friend Gina's sign said, "I march because Georgians of all ability deserve dignity and respect." Trying to see who some of the other signs were. Oh, my friend Heather's sign. Let's see what her sign said. "Stop the war on women."
Oh, nice.
Yeah, that was a good one. Let's see now. Let's see what some of the others said. Some of them were commercially printed, but most of them were not. Let's see. I did the fewer walls, more bridges. Let's see what else. Here's another one of the crowd. Free hugs. Grab them by the Putin. Veterans against Trump. And justice for all. Equal pay. This was the center of this sign was path to citizenship, and around it said equal pay, social justice, safe school zones, equal no guns, and fund Planned Parenthood. Kind of covered a lot of ground there.
Yeah.
Like I said, I kind of stuck to the keep it simple kind of thing. I figured not that many people could read it otherwise.
So why did you have...
Oh, this was a good one. Hide the nuclear launch codes. Also Sikhs for human rights. It was it was a very intersectional march.
Well, why did you have a sign that said uninsurable?
Because I am actually. I had spent probably after my divorce, I was shocked to learn that I could not obtain insurance on my own. I had it through my former husband's work. And when I moved and left Alabama, I'd been with Blue Cross Blue Shield. And when I crossed state lines and had to, continue the coverage, when I changed my address, they said, "Oh, we can't cover you anymore." So I reached out to Georgia Blue Cross Blue Shield, and they said, "Oh, we don't want to cover you." And I'm like, "Really? Why is that?" Because I was really healthy, really healthy. And I was kind of a bit of a health fanatic, in fact, so I'd gone to a wellness physician and, I'd done some things to optimize my health, but apparently they were concerned that I had some sort of disease, I guess. I don't know. They rejected my application, said, "Try again in 5 years." Maybe it was because I was on antidepressants because of my divorce, but they didn't want to touch me with a 10-foot pole. I tried again with a different insurer and the same result. I had literally no ability to get insurance for at least 2 years. And I just kept hoping I didn't cut a finger off. Accidents, I couldn't get anything.
Right.
And I had a friend who had the reverse problem. She had had an accident and she couldn't even get coverage for cancer. She was completely uninsurable until she got a job and got group coverage. I found a bridge program through an arts organization, and because my firm represents artists in various organizational capacities, I was able to slide in on this bridge program with Kaiser Permanente, which covers on the basis of as if you're a group. And so I had coverage on the bridge program, and that coverage, as it was, you can only be on it for so many years, and you have to have certain income requirements, which weren't a problem because I was rebuilding my firm post-recession, so I met all that. But the bridge program was expiring for me just as ACA was passed, and ACA was the best thing ever. All my pre-existing conditions, fine, whatever. They couldn't discriminate on age. They couldn't discriminate against because I was a woman or had a mental health condition, which at that point that had resolved. Enough time had passed that I was well again. And, everything was dandy. But one of the major campaign promises of the Trump administration was that they were going to fundamentally change ACA, if not get rid of it. And so, without that, I am uninsurable. Now, just as this recent tax bill has passed, this alleged tax reform that has reversed the mandate and all of the various effects that the Republican, commissioners of insurance in various states have had to diminish what was once the grandeur, to the extent that there was grandeur in the ACA, the Affordable Care Act, that is. Fortuitously, I have remarried someone with group coverage.
That's good.
So I will not be affected by all of the anticipated premium increases and all the other changes that people who, had I not married, will be affected, But fortunately, I work for someone who works for a Fortune 100 best employers to work for company, so they have great benefits. Good. Yeah, so I'm lucky. But you know what? I know how lucky I am. I know how lucky my friend is that barely got coverage through a group. I know how unlucky people are going to be who remain subject to only the ACA. I fear for my elderly relatives who are on Medicare or Medicaid. My aunt, who just turned 65, was paying $1,500 a month for health care, even through ACA, and now is on Medicare. And if they tinker with that much, they'll ruin it. Do you mind if we take a quick break?
Yeah, let's take a pause.
Yeah.
And we are back from our break. Still talking to Susan Billeaud. And so let me ask you about the chants that you heard or learned or...
I've probably forgotten them by now.
Okay.
I'm sure I've forgotten them by now.
That's fine.
There was a lot of, I remember Gerald Griggs leading one about not one step back. That was his big chant. And I believe the organization that did the Women's March now is called the Georgia Alliance for Social Justice, and they sell a t-shirt now with not one step back on it. So that was a big one. I can't remember them. I can't remember. I learned them on the spot, and I've not had occasion to hear them again. But they were, sort of steeped in the history of the civil rights movement.
Okay.
And they were just spot on. I bet you Steve Eberhardt can tell you all about them.
Yeah, I'll be interviewing him within the next few days. So.
Yeah.
But you seemed to be in a pretty unique position as far as being able to see the speakers.
I was next to the stage the entire time and walked in front of the sign for the Women's March the entire way down the street. But how we ended up in front of that sign was kind of circuitous and spoke to the volume of the crowd, actually. So the way it went down was, we were in this room, this little fish tank of a room, and the rain ended, and, at some point it became time to go. And I don't know who was keeping the time, but it was time. And so we went out the side door and walked around the front of the civil rights, well, it's called the Center for Civil and Human Rights, on Ivan Allen and, I guess, what is that, Centennial Olympic Park Drive. Mm-hmm. And so we walked around front. There was this stage that had been erected, and there were TV cameras on their own little pedestals, all around. And there were tents on sort of the side where I don't know who they were in there, but there were people in there with, I guess, the audio-visual people and maybe working journalists were there. And until that moment, and I'm not even sure, it wasn't until the speakers started speaking that I became aware of how incredibly big the crowd was. And I don't know what the crowd count was for it, but I believe I heard something like 40,000. I mean, it was enormous. And it just went on and was spread out. And the ground was fairly flat there, and I was not on the stage. I was like standing alongside with Gina's stuff because Gina couldn't carry it, right? And she needed a lot of stuff. She has a disorder that can cause her to overheat, and so she needs hydration, and she just can't be too warm. So body temperature regulation is part of it, et cetera. So they would say things, and it would be almost like a call and response. And I would hear the response roll from where we were standing with these huge speakers all the way back. And what I learned later was that the people who were out, and apparently they extended all the way to the world of Coca-Cola and beyond, they actually couldn't hear the speakers. Like, I don't think anyone was prepared for the size of the crowd. How could they have been, But you could hear the word sort of passing, and it wasn't an echo. You could hear the word passing all the way back, away from us, to some distant point. And it went on like that for a good half hour at least. And, there was a lot of, I think, the organizers and then the people who were helping the organizers, there was just a lot of us trying to sort out who the players were and who were the crowd and who were the journalists and stuff like that. It was at the very beginning, but it all seemed, under control at that point. And then the second time I realized how big the crowd was, there was a time when the organizers were then supposed to leave the stage, walk to somewhere near where Spring and Centennial Olympic Park intersected. In the interim, I had met a volunteer. Her name was Mildred Sawyer, a lovely woman. And she kind of took Gina under her wing too. And Mildred had a bullhorn and a walkie-talkie and various other cool equipment that came in handy. And Mildred and I were trying to get Gina to the parade, to the banner. And we lost everyone. Like, there was a train that left the station. We were in the train. And somehow in the push and pull, because none of the participants knew that they were in the way, the train went one direction and we broke off and went another. And so we just got to high ground. We went up to Ivan Allen Boulevard. I think the train went straight down through the crowd from the Civil for Senator Rights towards where Spring and Centennial Olympic Park meet. But we took a left because it was like, Gina just said to me, I don't think I can go that way. I need to get out of this crowd. So we took a left and we went up to Ivan Allen Jr. Boulevard because it was the nearest street. And we figured we could get clear up there. And I don't think we knew that we couldn't get down from Ivan Allen onto Centennial. But I also don't think we just knew how many freaking people were there. So we got up there through thick and thin, and we realized that we were behind the crowd, that the crowd was all like from Ivan Allen going toward World of Coke at our feet. And we got up on this overpass over Spring Street on Ivan Allen, and we looked down, and we just looked at each other and went, there's no way we can get through that. There's just, because as much as it took for us just to walk the, maybe 100 yards less to Ivan Allen, it was probably something closer to 50 yards to Ivan Allen, there's just no way we're going to get there. And so Gina's kind of freaking out because she's like, I have to get to the front of the parade. This is what I want to do. This is what I need to do. I need to get with the organizers. I hope they don't leave without me. And I said, look, between us, we hatched a plan to just walk down Ivan Allen to William Street, walk down William Street. We walked all the way down. We looked down Baker Street. We could see the zoo at Centennial Olympic Park. We kept on walking. We walked all the way to John Portman Boulevard. I'm like, look, path of least resistance, let's walk here. There was a lovely sidewalk, take a right, and then we'll walk back down Centennial Olympic Park. And even if they start, maybe we'll catch them on the way. Like, I thought that was our best shot because we couldn't tell had they started walking or anything. So we went down John Portman, took a right, and went back toward the crowd on Centennial Olympic Park. And sure enough, the organizers are just sort of standing there, grouping up. Baton Bob is standing there in front with his baton, and his mask and his very Mardi Gras-like apparel. I much approve of. And so we got there in time. Gina was content. Mildred and I and the other volunteers formed kind of a bubble in front. There was just a ton of media. And like I said, only about the time we looked down on the crowd did we appreciate how many people were there. People lining the sidewalks. Like I said, just a ton of media in front of us, a ton of freelance photographers, international press was there. And so I joined the volunteers. I was carrying Gina's stuff, and I was like keeping my eye on her. But she linked arms with Shirley Franklin and Stacey Abrams and her hero, John Lewis, who she adores. There were these other people there who I didn't know, who seemed to be sort of old school activists, who knew the drill. And we just formed like this little sort of bubble and pushed forward through the media, asking them to step back as we went for miles, walked towards CNN. And the most astonishing thing, in my view, about passing by CNN was that there were no CNN media in front of CNN. Zero.
Okay.
In retrospect, CNN covered a lot of cities.
Mm-hmm.
They did not cover Atlanta. I have no idea who made that editorial decision, but there were media from everywhere, local, all the way to international. CNN, doors were closed. We walked right past them. Nobody, not a single camera crew.
That is interesting.
And then the reports later, they would have reports from Washington, New York, Chicago, Houston, St. Louis, who knows, like everywhere. Atlanta was noticeably missing from that coverage. And again, I have no idea why. I don't remember if people had theories, what those were. I would hate to misrepresent them. But there was a sense that there was some kind of reason, that it wasn't an inadvertent omission. But CNN didn't cover Atlanta at all.
Interesting.
And we went on for miles. And I later saw helicopter photos, and I talked to people who, were still leaving Centennial Park by the time we arrived 4 miles later at Liberty Park. And they kept walking. And they were walking 45 minutes, an hour after we left. They were still leaving Centennial Park. That's how big a crowd it was. And there's this one shot where the sort of the Ferris wheel, in England they call it the eye, right? Mm-hmm. But the big Ferris wheel is like right at the apex of where we turned, and just the crowds going down both streets. And that's just what it was like. There wasn't enough room in Liberty Park. Once again, a lot of people couldn't hear the speakers.
Let me go back to the speakers, because I was just wondering if there are any specific moments of speeches that you remember that really stood out to you.
Well, Gina's speech was very touching. And I guess everybody sort of spoke to their ethnic background, to their gender background. I can't recall them all. I remember there was a Muslim woman speaking about peace, I remember Gerald Griggs, who is a black man, mm-hmm. the attorney, the civil rights lawyer, talking about, the not one step back, that we are going to fight, and he is a fighter. And there were some other speakers, and then there was John Lewis saying, I don't remember him being particularly fiery. I suppose I appreciated that because of his position, he should be more diplomatic. I don't remember if Hank Johnson spoke or not. I believe Stacey Abrams did. There was a group of immigrant children.
Oh, wow.
Teenagers. And I can't remember their organization, but the leader of this group was a woman who I believe was a Jewish lesbian, maybe? I don't remember. But they were talking about, dreamers, about immigration. So it was very intersectional. It was a very good, I think, cross-section of the various issues of concern. There were a lot of, there was just a lot. It was just a lot. And, I remember the subjects, I think, more than I remember any particular moments. But it was kind of overwhelming. I mean, between the crowd and the media and the speeches. But I'm sure somewhere someone recorded the speeches. Mm-hmm. There were cameras everywhere.
Well, did you see any law enforcement?
Yeah.
What was your interaction with them? What was your sense about that?
I didn't interact with them very much, but they seemed up to it. I guess, coming from New Orleans, a lot of Mardi Gras parades are attended by, law enforcement of various stripes, including mounted police. So I don't really worry much about them. And, maybe that's my privilege. Maybe that's being a white woman, that I always assume they're there for my protection and not to arrest me for something. But they all seem fairly jovial, fairly supportive, or neutral, and very relaxed. I mean, their body language, they didn't seem overly concerned about anything. They just kind of let us do what we needed to do. But of course, the organizers had paid them to be there. So they were, doing an overtime detail. And I seem to recall before the parade, there was a fundraiser because they had to raise something like $40,000.
Oh, wow.
For AV equipment and for overtime for the police and for the parade permits. So I think that figure's correct. You could ask Gina or Janelle or Gerald about that. Oh, goodness. So they passed the hat before the whole thing started.
Well, did you see any opposition protesters?
I don't recall any. I was pleasantly surprised by that, but I don't recall any. Maybe had anyone expected this to be any kind of big deal? Mm-hmm. And maybe I should have had an inkling it was going to be, because I was hearing from friends from Fayetteville all the way to Marietta about doing this thing, and everywhere in between.
Good question. How did you hear about the march?
I think I was aware of it almost immediately. I mean, as soon as the election happened, there was word of this women's march on Washington. I assume it was through social media, or it's possible that Gina just came to me directly and said, hey, listen, I'm organizing this thing. Would you help me? And I didn't do much but help her that day. It's not like I helped the march, But I don't recall specifically when I first heard about it. It was sort of in the water. Everybody kind of knew about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, you talked about walking by CNN, but what did you think of general media coverage of the march?
There was a lot of interest. That's why we were so shocked. I mean, there was a lot of discussion after the parade about where was CNN, because everybody was there. Helicopters were there. Drones were there. We were there. Guys who, may have been with foreign press. They appeared to be. And like I said, a ton of freelance guys, but there were probably 20 photographers that followed us the entire route. And there were a lot of reasons between, the civil rights folks, the politicians who were there. I mean, at the Liberty Park end of things, Hank Johnson even slid a John Ossoff introduction in there.
Oh, wow.
I don't think that was on the agenda. There was some discussion about that later, but he, Ossoff was his protege, and so he handed off his time to John Ossoff.
Oh, okay.
So that was his first campaign stop, was the Women's March.
Didn't know that. That's interesting.
Yeah, but there were a lot of people, celebrities apparently. Again, I'm at an age in my life where there are just too many damn famous people. Like, I literally I watch an award show and go, who are all these famous people? Like, I don't
I know.
Everybody's
I'm
like,
at the same
ooh,
age.
these people, who da-da-da-da-da, and I'm like, no idea.
Yeah, their names I hear, and I'm like, oh yeah, they're I guess a thing. I don't know what they're doing.
I have no idea either. So there were famous people there. I was aware that there were famous people there and that I should be impressed, and I'm sure I was.
I saw a picture of Charlize Theron at one of the marches. I don't remember which one though.
Yeah, there was the chick who was in Supergirl. I remember there being a lot of talk about that. She wasn't at ours. She was at one of the others.
Okay.
I guess LA. I don't know.
Well, with Atlanta's industry, you would think that maybe I could see how there would be some celebrities.
Yeah, well, there were some musical people that was told were important. And then, of course, Larry Platt is a famous musical person with his Pants on the Ground song from the 90s. So there was one. But he is really more of a community activist now. And just trying to push for things like fair housing, food security, stuff like that. So.
Yeah. How did you get home from the march?
The train.
Okay.
Yeah.
What was that like?
Fun. It was fun. I mean, there were just a lot of people on the train who had come from the march. A lot of us had our little pink pussy hats on and our signs, and the mood was jubilant, because that was the thing. I think we started this whole train by you asking me about how it felt.
Mm-hmm.
And it felt like a big warm hug. I mean, it was loving. It was incredible. I had no idea. And there was unity, and there was peace, and there was just a shared, mostly, I'm sure there was some variation, but a mostly shared vision of what we wanted. It was a march for something. It wasn't a march against something. And there's something to that vibe, And even though there were inconveniences, the rain and the inability to hear the speakers, I mean, everybody had an amazing, uplifting experience uniting with other people. And for the first time, I think, since the campaign's divisiveness, so many of us felt like, okay, And so that was the mood all the way home. And I remember I got off the train at my station, and I was alone, and I'm still wearing my hat, and I decided I would walk home because it was about a half mile. And so I'm leaving the station, walking down this hallway, and I passed this young black man with dreadlocks and a Rastafarian hat, and he looked at me and said, "Good job." And I remember just glowing that was just like the greatest. He must have been 25, and he just, it to this day brings a tear to my eye.
Yeah.
Joining together in that struggle. I don't know how other white women feel about it. For me, it felt like a privilege, and it still does. So, yeah, it was a beautiful, beautiful day, and it just soup to nuts continued that way. Whenever you introduce politicians into the mix, there's always a change, I think, in the energy of things. It becomes a little more mercenary, in my view. And there was a bit of that. There was a bit of a sense that for some folks, I guess, it was a necessary appearance. There was also some discussion, I think, that some of the folks who were politicians, had been approached and had initially not answered those requests to join the march. And it was only when they began to realize it was going to be a big deal that there was suddenly a great deal of interest from politicians. Mm-hmm. And I guess a little disappointment that some folks were jumping in front of a parade, literally.
Right.
Literally in front of a parade. That when it was a request to do the right thing for the right reasons, it was overlooked somehow. But when it became clear that media was interested, then suddenly politicians were interested.
Coincidence?
I think not.
Well, how did you feel the day after the march?
It was beautiful. I mean, like I said, I think that fascism relies on a lot of things happening. And I think it's, again, not a coincidence that fascism is divisive, that it tries to pick apart relationships and connections between people as humans. It tries to demean and dehumanize groups according to types. I mean, none of that's an accident. Divide and conquer is not merely a cliche or a proverb or something. It is an actual tactic, and it's used expertly by people who wish to rise in power. And we had been subjected to that, and even within people who tended to lean left or to Democratic side, I mean, even between Hillary and Bernie, there was a great deal of divisiveness. But attempts were being made very actively, and still are, to divide people on racial, gender, religious, socioeconomic, all these lines, right? And this march felt like an affirmation that, you know what, we weren't alone. Whoever we were, whatever we weren't doing this by ourselves. We were united in a cause that was necessary. And there's a great deal of power in that. And shortly thereafter, because that was the inaugural march, right? Shortly thereafter, sort of the first big, hurtful executive order came along, and that sort of spawned the airport rallies, the Muslim ban.
The Muslim ban, okay.
Yeah, and so we got to see all of our old friends again with all new signs down at Hartsfield-Jackson. Yeah. And we did it again, and I brought along my boyfriend, who was then my boyfriend. And I told him, I said, you know, it isn't what you think it is, because he leans a bit conservative. And I said, you know, you have all these ideas of what these rallies are like and what they're going to be, and that they're going to be hateful and aggressive and egg throwing. And truth be told, they're lovely. They're really lovely. And I would encourage everyone to do one. I think it's becoming increasingly dangerous to do so in America, where I think about to have a whole new wave of protest marches coming up soon. We'll see. But all of the subsequent white supremacist marches, sorry if I misspoke, were ridiculous. They were petty, small, completely underwhelming. So, like I said, if I did see any resistance on the march, they were petty, small, and underwhelming, and I didn't notice.
So here's a fairly open-ended question. What do you hope will happen?
What do I hope will happen, or what do I expect will happen? Yeah, I hope the whole thing blows over. I hope Congress grows a spine. I hope that the pretty obvious Russian collaborators in our government are evicted from their positions. Okay. I hope that in 2018 we sweep Congress and take back at least some parts of the government so that we can return to our state of gridlock that we seemed to occupy during much of the Obama administration. Mm-hmm. Because I, for one, do not want a properly functional government when they operate this way. What I fear will happen is that the Senate Majority Leader will not seat Doug Jones, who recently won. I fear that they will be openly fascist very soon, and not merely suborning treason in less obvious ways, but openly supportive of it. I fear that we are on a path to something that we haven't seen in America. And it is very close to being a coup by our government. I am personally making preparations to leave the country if I need to.
Wow.
One of the great benefits of being an activist, and I'm barely an activist, honestly, is that maybe at some point, if I ever have to, I can make an asylum argument somewhere. I fear for my friends who are transgender. I fear for my friends who are Muslim. I fear for my friends who are brown of any stripe because they're increasingly subjected to police actions. I fear for my friends who are scientists and who work in government because they're being more and more actively repressed, more openly and boldly repressed. I fear for my friends who are less well-heeled, for my friends who are sick or disabled. They are becoming increasingly cast aside. I fear for my friends who are students and who are academics. The fascists do actively come after those people. I fear for my friends who are the good guys in government because they're being purged. I don't see this going well. And for all of our marches and for all of our activism and for all of our social media, the indications are not good. And our leadership, in quotes, because they're barely that, are increasingly taking steps internationally to isolate our country and to be openly polarizing. They are ceding the place that we once held as leaders internationally to powers in the world that are not friendly to democracies. And I don't think any of this is an accident. There is a very common thread, but I believe that the passage of this tax bill is the looting that precedes the eruption of civil violence. I believe that Vladimir Putin benefits from the American nation being plunged into social warfare. And I think that these foreign powers are, through their agents in this country, acting to create civil strife along socioeconomic lines. And they're going to continue to ratchet up that pain. If we do resist, we're playing into their hands. If we don't resist, we're eventually all going to be imprisoned and sent out to work camps as cheap labor. Either way, they win. I mean, my understanding of law, history, and economics informs me that this is a very terrible and frightening time in our history. And I just don't know how we're going to get out of this because, as so many writers say, institutions will not save us. And right now, institutions is about all we have. And I tend to concur. The folks that you think are going to stand up, back down. And I don't know why. The ones that put their reputation out.
Like who?
Susan Collins. Mm. Those guys, right? Jeff Flake. They take a serious stand against something.
Did Flake vote for the tax bill?
I don't know. Corker did.
I know Corker
after saying no to deficits.
Right, yeah.
And Susan Corker saying no to health care cuts and Social Security cuts, and then both flipped. Why?
Yeah.
Why? I mean, is it that the bribe just got good enough? Is it that, somebody had their family at gunpoint? I mean, why?
I have no idea.
Either answer is terrible. I mean, our government is not under our control anymore.
So how do you cope psychologically?
I do all I can and I plan. And honestly, I may tend to do less soon because, I've been warning my spouse that, there will come a time, and I'm hoping I can hold it off, that it won't be right now, because we're not really prepared right now, but there will come a time in the next couple of years where I may say, let's sell all the stuff. It's time. Before other people start selling all the stuff because they realize it's time. But I've seen people in my own neighborhood selling all the stuff because they're leaving the country. Got to admit, I'm a little jealous. They tell me it's nice out there, like sane and orderly.
Where are they going?
Europe, mainly. Mainly Europe. But yeah, they're leaving the country. They have a chance to get out. I've read a good amount about the Red Revolutions and the steps that were taken, the White Revolution and then the Red.
Russia and the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Well, the Soviet Union came after the Red, didn't it?
Right.
And so did the nationalization of property and so on. Like I said, social warfare benefits foreign powers more than it does us, but we're being prodded along toward it. And there's a lot of people who are going willingly who control our government. And I don't know who they are, and I don't know why. But the people who could and should be effective in taking a stand against this apparently have no power to do so. So who is it that has the power?
I don't know.
Somebody else.
Yeah, I don't know. But so you went to the march at the airport. I mean, the rally at the airport. Mm-hmm. How would you describe your other political participation since the march?
Just that, mainly, and then the March for Science.
Okay.
March for Science was kind of hilarious. After having gone to 2 serious political marches, and I'm not saying that the science march wasn't serious, but the science march was filled with, scientists. Mm-hmm. And scientists protesting is kind of amusing. Scientists protesting looks a lot like a white people death march.
Well, what do you mean?
Well, they didn't know the songs. And even though they were being taught the songs by the people who knew the songs, they weren't really singing. They weren't really singers. And it was hot that day. And, there were a lot of sciencey people, but the personalities are very interesting. And, I thought the march was going to be like a couple miles. I don't know when we broke off, but we were in Vihai. No, Little Five. We were in Little Five. At the point where I looked at the 2 people I was marching with and said, wrecking bar's right there. You want to just go have a beer and call the rest of this off? Because after a while, it just became people walking. Like, the signs were down. Everybody was tired. Everybody was dehydrated. Everybody just wanted to go back to the park where there were bathrooms and water stations and stuff like that. So it was a funny little march, the March for Science. Like I said, it was a serious march. There's a serious problem. Scientists are definitely under attack. Science as a concept is under attack repeatedly by thought police, word police, and actual internal censorship within, departments.
Well, I saw, the guidelines for the CDC.
CDC, HHS is being made to actually say actual propaganda, not just omitting words, but actually saying words. Using propagandistic titles for actual legal titles. In other words, instead of saying the Affordable Care Act, they now are mandated to say Obamacare. Whatever that's about, I kind of know. But yeah, no, science is definitely under attack. Smart people are under attack. In any revolution, the smart people are among the first against the wall. The teachers, the professionals like lawyers. And I have to say, that was another motivation, my profession. I am on several lists publicly available lists, bar rolls, in 4 states where they know who I am, they know where I live, they know all about me. I'm pretty easy to come after. I've done what I can to lock those accounts down. But as a profession, lawyers are dangerous. Teachers are dangerous to revolutions, to coups. Scientists are dangerous to coups. Journalists are dangerous to coups. There's a lot of people who are dangerous to coups, and they're going to come after us. They are already coming after us in subtle ways. Journalists, scientists, teachers, they're the ones right now who are under attack. But this is how it starts always. And I can't say that I'm optimistic about us making it out of this without the loss of life in the political fray. There will be a moment at which this does get real. And it's no longer immigrants they're hauling from houses in the middle of the night. There's no longer immigrants they're picking up at bus stops and sending away. It's going to be other people too, soon. Because even now, white, not even white, Hispanic and Latino American citizens are getting caught up in ICE raids. Immigration and something. I don't remember what ICE stands for anymore.
Yeah.
But they're getting caught up in ICE raids, and they're being denied the right to counsel and other civil rights that are theirs because they are actually American citizens. They're being denied the opportunity to prove they're American citizens, so there's some plausible deniability about their denial of these rights. It's happening all the time. People who have the right to be in America are being deported or sent to, what we call them, black something sites, fill in the blank.
Rendition or...
Yeah, nobody knows where they are, but they're in private prisons, and they're being paid. Stockholders are being paid, and that's all that really matters.
I have one more question for you, and then you can wrap this up if you like. But what would your advice be for anyone who's considering going to a march in the future?
Prepare. Because, for all of my concerns about this particular march, we weren't tear gassed. We weren't hauled away.
Right.
We weren't caught up in counter protests. We got lucky. I don't think we'll be lucky in the future. I think, you ought to watch 1971, the documentary about the COINTELPRO.
Okay.
1971 was about a group of white people who inadvertently discovered an FBI plot to plant counter protesters among the civil rights activists in the 60s. And to inform on them. And because the protests are now such a bigger deal and the stakes are so much higher, yeah, we're going to be infiltrated. Maybe we weren't at first, but we will be increasingly. And what happens and what has happened in the past is government has put in place people who were picked up on felony charges and who, in exchange for their freedom, were convinced to basically turn informant, but it was a special kind of informant. They not only informed about the activities going forward of the activists, where they would be, when they would be there, what they were planning to do, but they also were responsible for inciting or attempting to incite riots. There was a lot of discussion in that documentary I mentioned, 1971, about guys who were obviously FBI and CIA. They were just a little too clean cut. They were just a little too square at showing up at anti-war rallies. And marches, and the folks who got the records that exposed COINTELPRO were actually there to burn draft records, and they happened to retrieve documents that had this word, and the word went in the right ear. Things connected up, and suddenly there was a Senate hearing, because back in the day, apparently there were actually patriots in charge, as opposed to my opinion of Congress today. But these guys would attempt to incite violence in otherwise peaceful protests. And in so doing, they hoped to then incite a police action and then public sympathy against the anti-war movement, against the civil rights movement. So the goal was to make it appear that these peaceful rallies weren't so peaceful, so that the propaganda machine can then kick in and take them down. So I've been seeing a lot of things on social media that were strategies to deal with situations if violence is to occur. And it has nothing to do with being self-protective, and it has everything to do with distinguishing yourself from the violent actors, because there is every sense that we are going to be infiltrated, we already have been, that there will be violence at future rallies to discourage protesters and to discourage, to create propaganda machines. And so right now the advice, again, prepare. Sharpie markers are your friend. So is clear nail polish. Write information on your legs, write information on your arms. You don't know where you'll be shackled. To cover up the Sharpie marker in case it's washed off.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And the number should be the get out of jail number, the guys with the bail, and your health insurance information, your driver's license information, so that if you're picked up and unconscious, what's going to happen. If you're stripped of all of your information and you have one phone call, don't open your phone. Make sure your phone's locked down. Make sure it's turned off, or make sure that if it's turned on, that it's at least lockable, even erasable, so they don't get all your information all at once, because they can hack certain things. Preparing for your information to be seized, for you to be physically seized, and again, for you to be knocked unconscious. What's going to happen to your body while you're out? Just crazy thoughts like that. What happens if you're tear gassed? Apparently Maalox and water is an antidote for tear gas. Didn't know that before I started protesting. But the current advice on dealing with violence inciters is to sit down, put your sign down, and remain silent. Immediately. Fall to the ground, sit down, put your sign down, and remain silent.
Okay, well, I'm sorry we got cut off, but I think the last thing you said is it's going to get rougher.
Yeah.
Was I accurate there? Okay.
Yeah, it's going to get rougher, and there are certain countermeasures that protesters are sharing. We're using social media with the net neutrality rule. They're hoping to cut us off from one another. There's a lot of benefits to losing net neutrality, among them ending protest organization efforts. Countermeasures will have to be invented. It's, like I said, it's a terrible time for freedom. It's a terrible time for civil rights. It's a terrible time for ordinary citizens. It's a terrible time for our economy. And the thing that I think all of us must realize is that none of those conditions are natural. They're all created. They're all created by the same hand or group of hands, and they're all done quite intentionally. Our freedom is directly under attack, and many of us individually are directly under attack right now. It will only increase. We're like the frogs in the pot, they're boiling us slowly. Some of us see the trends, though, and it's very disturbing. So good luck to the people who don't see the trends or who don't want to recognize them. But the signs are not good. And to the extent that in social media people perhaps thought I was an alarmist, I think they're learning that I kind of saw this coming.
Well, Susan, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me about your experience and share your views on this. It's been...
I wish I had better news. The news from the near future is not good. The news in the distant future is a little foggier.
Maybe just a little bit.
Yep.
All right.
And there is hope.